before any investigation began, before theories, suspects, or timelines. There was a 14-year-old girl called Lisa Jane Hession. Lisa was born on the 12th of April 1970 in Leigh, Greater Manchester. She was the only daughter of Christine Hession and was raised in a close, single-parent household on Bonnywell Road, alongside her mother and her widowed grandmother, Ellen, known to family as Nellie. By her early teenage years, Lisa had grown into a confident and outgoing young girl. Friends and classmates later described her as popular, academically capable, and full of energy. She attended Bedford High School in Leigh, where she took her studies seriously and had already begun a childcare course, an early indication of the direction she hoped her future might take. Outside the classroom, Lisa was active and athletic. She had a natural flair for gymnastics and ran cross-country with the local amateur athletics club, Leigh Harriers. Like many teenagers in the mid-1980s, she was also developing her own sense of identity, with an interest in fashion, music, and the culture of the time. She was known among friends as a fan of David Bowie, although her favorite song was said to be "You Really Got Me" by the Kinks. Those who knew her remember small, ordinary moments, classroom jokes, passing comments, the kind of everyday interactions that rarely seem important at the time, but later become lasting memories. By the time she reached her mid-teens, Lisa stood around 5'4", with short, wavy brown hair often worn with a distinctive curl across her forehead. To her family, she was a daughter and a granddaughter. To her friends, she was confident, lively, and approachable. Nothing in her background suggested vulnerability. Nothing in her routine suggested danger. And that is what makes what happened next so difficult to comprehend. Because cases like this do not begin with fear. They begin with normal life, ordinary people, ordinary streets, and a future that should have stretched far beyond a single winter evening in Leigh. On the afternoon of Saturday, the 8th of December 1984, Lisa Hession spent several hours getting ready for a pre-Christmas party. The gathering had been organized by friends from school and was being held at the home of a 16-year-old friend on Leigh Road, roughly 2 miles from Lisa's home on Bonnywell Road. Lisa's mother agreed to let her attend on one condition, that she would be back home by 10:30 that evening. At around 6:45 p.m., Lisa left the house in good spirits to make her way to the party. By all accounts, the evening was uneventful. Friends later stated that Lisa spent much of the night socializing and staying close to people she knew. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Lisa left the party to walk home. Multiple witnesses would later report seeing her as she made her way back through the town center, continuing along St. Helens Road, and then turning into Buck Street. At around 10:35 p.m., Lisa was seen at a point less than a minute's walk from her home. This would become the final confirmed sighting of her alive. She was within sight of the streets she knew, within reach of the place she was expected to return to. And then, within that final short stretch, something happened. At approximately 10:35 p.m., Lisa Hession was seen turning into Buck Street, a point less than a minute's walk from her home. From that location, the route ahead would have been the most direct and logical way back. While it cannot be stated with certainty that this was the path she always took, it was the simplest and most natural route available. She was close to home, close to familiar streets, within reach of the place she was expected to return to. And yet, somewhere within that final short stretch, her journey stopped. No witnesses reported hearing a struggle. No disturbance was noted by nearby residents at the time. In an area bordered by houses, that absence is significant. Because when an incident occurs within such a short distance and goes unnoticed, it often suggests it was both quick and controlled. For investigators, the location raises a crucial question. Not just how the attack happened, but why it happened at that exact point. Because this was not an isolated space. It was part of the natural route a local person would understand, a place where visibility could drop, and footfall at that time of night might be limited. In other words, the final minute of Lisa's journey may have been short. but it was also predictable. The exact sequence of events after Lisa Hession turned into Buck Street remains unclear. At some point within that final short stretch, she either encountered or was approached by a lone male and was drawn into a nearby alleyway between Newlands Road and Rugby Road. The position within the alley where the incident occurred was not easily visible from the surrounding houses. It was a recessed area leading toward garage doors and a garden gate, a space that, particularly at night, offered reduced visibility from nearby windows. What is clear is that the encounter was brief. There were no reports of shouting, no reports of a disturbance, and subsequent house-to-house inquiries found that no residents recalled seeing anything unusual at the time. For investigators, that absence is significant, because when an incident takes place within close proximity to homes, yet goes unnoticed, it often suggests the offender acted quickly, with purpose, and with an understanding of the environment. The location itself was only a short distance from Lisa's home, close enough that she would have expected to reach safety within moments. Instead, the final part of her journey ended in a place that offered just enough concealment for an attack to occur without interruption. The exact sequence of events after Lisa Hession turned into Buck Street remains unclear. However, police later indicated that the initial confrontation did not occur within the recessed garage area itself. Instead, it appears the attack began earlier within the alley, before Lisa was moved further inside. This detail is significant, because the recessed section, where Lisa was ultimately found, was not clearly visible from the entrance at the Newlands Road end. From the outside, the space appears to be just another narrow passage. Only once inside does the recess, leading toward the garage doors and garden gate, become apparent. For someone unfamiliar with the layout, that space would not be an obvious place to move toward in the dark. But for someone who already knew it was there, it offered something very specific. Concealment. Concealment from passing pedestrians. Concealment from nearby windows. And just enough depth within the alley to carry out an assault without immediate interruption. If the attack did begin before the recess, it suggests the offender was not simply reacting in the moment. He knew where he could move without being seen, and more importantly, he knew where that space existed before he entered it. The attack was carried out by a lone male. Evidence indicated that the offender prevented Lisa from calling for help and used force to control the situation. The assault was brief, but it escalated quickly. Lisa sustained injuries consistent with a struggle, indicating that she fought back. The cause of death was later determined to be pressure applied to her neck. Investigators also concluded that the assault had a sexual motive, although it did not develop into a prolonged attack. The coroner would later rule her death an unlawful killing, noting that the fatal outcome may not have been the attacker's original intention. What is clear is that everything that happened in that space occurred within a very short period of time. No disturbance was reported. No witnesses came forward who had heard anything unusual. In practical terms, the entire incident likely unfolded in minutes. Once the attack had taken place, the offender's priority would have been to leave the area quickly. From the recessed section of the alley, the most direct route led back toward Newlands Road. At that time of night, the surrounding streets were primarily quiet and residential. However, it was a Saturday evening, a time when there could still be occasional movement from people returning home, passing traffic, or late pedestrians. That created a narrow but important balance. Enough activity that someone leaving the area would not automatically draw attention, but quiet enough that any prolonged presence in the alley itself would increase the risk of being seen. In practical terms, the safest option for the offender would have been to move away immediately and re-enter the open street environment. From there, he could simply appear to be another person walking home. If he was familiar with the area, he would have known exactly how long he had before the risk of interruption increased. And in a timeline measured in minutes, that knowledge matters. The murder of Lisa Hession shocked the local community. Greater Manchester Police responded with a major investigation, placing Detective Superintendent Terence Millard in overall command. From an early stage, investigators determined that the motive for the attack was sexual. Several factors also suggested that the offender was either local to Leigh or had significant knowledge of the area. Initially, detectives were hopeful the case could be solved quickly. Within days, a local man was arrested on suspicion of murder, but he was later released and no charges were brought. As the investigation widened, police began examining other incidents that had taken place nearby. At a press conference just days after Lisa's death, officers revealed that 3 young women had been subjected to sexually motivated attacks within roughly a 1-mile radius in the months leading up to the murder. In one of those incidents, the victim had been attacked while walking home along Rugby Road, directly behind the alley where Lisa was later found. She described being approached from behind, her mouth covered, and being threatened. In each of the reported assaults, the offender used intimidation and threats to control his victims. The man described across these incidents was said to be a young, slim, dark-haired male with a local accent, believed to be in his late teens or early 20s. One of the attacks had taken place the evening before Lisa's murder. In that case, the victim managed to fight back and escape. Police later released a composite image of the man they wished to identify, stating they wanted to speak with him in connection with the earlier assaults. Despite generating new lines of inquiry, none led to an arrest. In the months that followed, another sexually motivated attack occurred in Leigh, only a short distance from the original crime scene. Again, the offender approached a lone female, used sudden violence, and fled when interrupted. For investigators, these incidents raised a difficult possibility that the person responsible for Lisa's death may not have begun that night, and may not have stopped afterwards. When detectives are faced with a violent offense carried out within a confined geographic area, one of the first considerations is the offender's relationship to that environment. In cases like this, investigators look for signs of familiarity. The location of Lisa Hession's murder, combined with the earlier reported assaults, formed a cluster within a relatively small radius of Leigh. That pattern immediately raises a practical question. Was the offender operating within an area he already knew well? Offenders who commit attacks in locations where visibility is limited, yet escape without being seen, often demonstrate an understanding of movement patterns, sight lines, and quiet routes. That does not necessarily mean the individual lived on the street itself, but it does suggest prior knowledge of the area. Detectives would typically examine who routinely moved through those locations: residents, local workers, regular visitors, or individuals who had reason to pass through those streets without attracting attention. The fact that multiple incidents occurred within walking distance of one another also reduces the likelihood of random chance. Instead, it points toward what investigators often describe as a comfort zone, an area where an offender feels confident enough to act and confident enough to return. In practical terms, this means the person responsible may have been someone who already understood the geography of those streets long before the night of Lisa's murder. In the years following Lisa Hession's murder, police across Greater Manchester and the wider Northwest were still dealing with a number of serious sexual offenses. Newspaper reports from the late 1980s show that specialist teams continued to investigate attacks across the region. These incidents were not necessarily linked to Lisa's case. However, they demonstrate that the wider concern about sexually motivated offenses had not gone away. For investigators, this created an ongoing challenge: separating unrelated crimes from those that might share a common offender. When Lisa Hession was murdered in 1984, forensic science was very different from what it is today. Although DNA had already been discovered as a scientific concept, its use in criminal investigations was still in its infancy. The first time DNA profiling was used in a criminal investigation in the UK was only 2 years later, in 1986, and by 1987, it had helped secure the first conviction based on DNA evidence. At the time of Lisa's murder, detectives relied heavily on witness statements, house-to-house inquiries, physical evidence such as fibers, footprints, and fingerprints. There was no national DNA database to search. That would not exist until 1995, when the United Kingdom created the National DNA Database to allow police to compare crime scene DNA with known offenders. Even then, the early database was limited in size and capability, expanding gradually through the late 1990s and early 2000s as more samples were taken from arrested individuals. As the database grew, it began producing matches linking suspects to crimes, sometimes years after offenses had been committed. This marked a turning point. For the first time, police had a tool that could identify an offender not through witnesses or confession, but through biology. In recent years, forensic science has moved even further. Investigators can now use a technique known as genetic genealogy. Instead of looking for a direct match in a criminal database, detectives compare crime scene DNA with profiles in genealogy databases to identify relatives of a potential suspect. This method famously led to the arrest of the man known as the Golden State Killer in 2018, more than 4 decades after his crimes began, when investigators traced his identity through distant family connections and then confirmed the match with discarded DNA. Cases that once seemed impossible to solve are now being reopened using the same approach, with cold cases decades old producing new suspects through advances in DNA analysis. In practical terms, modern forensic technology allows investigators to do something that simply wasn't possible in 1984: find a suspect even if that person has never previously been arrested. However, in the United Kingdom, the use of this type of genetic genealogy is far more restricted than in the United States. While police can analyze DNA recovered from crime scenes and compare it against the National DNA Database, accessing public genealogy databases to identify relatives of a suspect is tightly controlled and rarely authorized. These safeguards exist because of privacy and legal concerns around using the DNA of individuals who are not themselves suspected of any crime. In practical terms, this means that some of the techniques used to identify offenders decades later in other countries are not yet routinely available to investigators in the UK. In 2011, Greater Manchester Police carried out a large-scale DNA screening exercise involving men from the Leigh and Wigan areas. Despite the scale of this operation, no match was found. However, the profile that was recovered remains viable. Investigators have stated that it is sufficient to identify the offender if his DNA is ever taken in connection with another matter or entered into the National DNA Database. In practical terms, this means the case has not reached a dead end. Police do not necessarily need new evidence from the crime scene. What they need is a name. Because if the individual responsible is ever identified and lawfully swabbed, that DNA profile could confirm his involvement. More than anything else, this case is not about an offender. It is about a 14-year-old girl who never made it home. Lisa Hession was a daughter, a granddaughter, a friend, a young girl with plans, interests, and a future that should have stretched far beyond a single winter night in Leigh. In the years since her death, technology has changed. Investigations have evolved. New forensic tools have been developed. And yet, despite all of that, one question still remains unanswered. Who was responsible? For Lisa's family, this has never been history. It has been a lifetime of not knowing. A lifetime of birthdays that never came. Of moments that should have existed, but didn't. Cases like this are not measured only in evidence files or investigation reports. They are measured in absence. An empty chair, a voice that was never heard again, a life that stopped at 14. Somewhere, someone knows what happened that night. And until that truth is spoken, this case is not closed. Lisa Hession should have been able to walk home safely,